Hello, everyone. My name is Ben Odell, and I'm with the Center for Faith and Opportunity Initiatives at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, or what we like to call the Partnership Center. We're delighted that you've joined us today for another webinar in our series on mental illness. This webinar is focused on supporting families experiencing mental illness through the holiday season. I'm excited to introduce our speakers here in a moment, but first, a few housekeeping notes. This is an educational webinar, which is off the record and not intended for press purposes. If you are a member of the press, we will be happy to connect you with our press office here at HHS after the program. If you're having difficulty hearing us clearly, you may find it helpful to call into the number provided by the Zoom webinar platform rather than listening through your computer. We found that sometimes that helps a little bit for sound quality. Note as well that the sound quality may be affected by the type of connection that you have to the internet or the device that you're using to participate in the webinar today. Also, as many people request, we will be sending a link to the recording of today's webinar along with the slides used for the presentation today. So look for that follow-up email in the next day or two. And if you have any questions, always feel free to email us at partnerships@hhs.gov. That's partnerships@hhs.gov. And finally, we do have a full program today, and we'll get to as many of your questions as possible. To do that, we want you to use the Q&A link. So that's up in the environment. You should be able to click on Q&A, and you should be able to type a question and a question in. And we want you to try that out right now. Go there and tell us where you're joining us from today. What are some of the places that you've joined? So click on the Q&A link and then type in the city and state you're joining us from today. I see Wyoming, Pennsylvania, Ohio, San Antonio, Wisconsin, Atlanta, Tennessee, California, Kentucky, all across the country. We're so excited to have so many of you here with us participating in this discussion. And so let's get into it. Many approach the holiday season of Thanksgiving and Christmas with glee and excitement. Alongside that joy, some friends and family can also be carrying some unspoken expectation, and there may be some unseen challenges that can sometimes be a stumbling block in our family relationships. What if we went into this holiday season a little different, with open eyes and a compassionate heart toward loved ones who may be experiencing the challenge of mental illness or other difficulties through this holiday season? In fact, for some adults and youth experiencing challenges like mental illness, the holidays can be challenging on multiple levels. Whether it's the disruption of normal schedules to the remembrance of adversity from the past, the holidays for some can be a time of dread and anxiety instead of glee and excitement. Through today's webinar, we plan to increase your awareness of those challenges and perspective toward considering ways that friends, family, and faith and community leaders can support and encourage these families through the holiday season. First, we'll get a chance to hear from Dr. Steve Grcevich from Key Ministry, who will share what he's seen that most affects clients, especially children, during the holiday season. Dr. Steve serves as the president and founder of Key Ministry. He serves as the primary vision caster and spokesperson for the ministry and plays an important role in Key's efforts to develop collaborations within and outside organizations and with the professional community. In addition to his ministry work, Dr. Grcevich is a child and adolescent psychiatrist who combines nearly 30 years of knowledge gained through clinical practice and teaching with extensive research experience evaluating medications prescribed to children and teens for ADHD, anxiety, and depression. In this webinar, we're also going to get a chance to hear from Jolene Philo from Different Dream Living, who will help us translate what she's learned growing up and being part of a family with special needs, which has included mental illness. Jolene Philo is both a parent and a daughter of loved ones with special needs and disabilities, as well as a former educator who worked with children for more than 25 years. She's written several books on caregiving, special needs parenting, and childhood PTSD, including the recently released Sharing Love Abundantly with Special Needs Families, the 5 Love Languages for Parents Raising Children with Disabilities, which she co-authored with Dr. Gary Chapman. She speaks internationally about caregiving and parenting children with special needs, and she blogs at differentdream.com. Jolene and her husband live in central Iowa, where it is very cold today. We will also have the privilege of hearing from Katie Donahoe, who will share her experience of living with someone with lived experience during the holiday season. After beginning recovery from her lifelong mental health challenges, Katie grew a passion to give back to the mental health community. She attended the University of Central Florida, where she studied psychology and creative writing. She began working for the National Alliance on Mental Illness, Greater Orlando, and has volunteered as a mental health professional and teacher in Sri Lanka, where she was able to pour into the mental health community overseas. Today, she is a public speaker for NAMI Greater Orlando and has spoken on the local, statewide, and national level. She continues to pursue her passion for mental health through her work and current study program for her master's in science degree and mental health counseling. So each of these presenters have a wealth of wisdom to share. So I'm excited to get into their presentations. So without further delay, let me turn the presentation over to our wonderful presenters. Dr. Steve, take it away.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for the very kind introduction. I'm Steve Grcevich, and I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. And what's interesting about this topic today is that I tend to get very, very busy during the holiday season, not necessarily think of up front. And going back now about 10 years, at one point, our practice became involved. We were part of a research project that was funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, looking at safety and side effect issues of the medicines that are typically used to treat kids with anxiety and depression. And around that time, as we had more kids who were struggling with those issues come to our practice, I made a couple of really interesting observations, and a certain pattern set in. My 4 busiest weeks of the year are typically the weeks, like the 2 weeks at the end of December and the first 2 weeks after school lets out. And so one of the things that became obvious is that for a lot of the kinds of kids and teens that we would see in a practice like ours, one of the biggest challenges that they experience over the holiday season is downtime. So that if you want to click to the next slide, Ben, so that like we see a lot of kids who maybe struggle with anxiety or depression or a lot of obsessive thinking or rumination, where the busyness of their routine is really adaptive for them. That, if they have too much time to think about stuff, they'll become significantly more anxious, more depressed. And being in school 7 hours a day, having 2 or 3 hours worth of homework to do at night, being involved in all of the extracurricular activities that a lot of our kids are involved with is actually really adaptive for them. And so one of the challenges for parents and family members to be aware of at this time of year, is that particularly if you have a kid who struggles with one of those types of internalizing conditions, when all of a sudden they find themselves with too much time on their hands, some of the ways that this oftentimes manifests itself is that parents see kids become more angry, more moody, more irritable, more emotional. And so when that pattern becomes somewhat obvious, or if you recognize this, thinking about like your own children or your own loved ones, one of the ways of planning ahead is to understand the notion of busy being better. And so doing some advanced planning over the holidays, being prepared, maybe, schedule some activities that you can go ahead and do as a family. In our particular area, Cleveland Museum of Art is world-renowned, and there's free admission like over the Christmas season. And so that's the kind of thing that folks will oftentimes take advantage of. One of the really neat things that we experienced firsthand growing up in a way that, friends and neighbors can support families is that, when my girls were younger, there was a woman at the end of our street, Mrs. Kendrick, whose husband was a pediatrician, and she would host a cookie baking day and welcome all the kids in the neighborhood. And they would come over and they would bake gingerbread men, bake cookies. They had a great day, and it oftentimes gave the parents in the neighborhood a little bit of a break, and served this purpose at the same time in terms of, helping to keep kids busy. Libraries are another wonderful resource that folks can tap into at this time of the year, because one of the adaptive strategies that I find a lot of our kids employ is that reading is something that can help them to be able to distract them from, again, their own obsessive thoughts, their own anxieties, and that, having lots of reading material around is something that you can do for a kid who deals with some of those challenges. If you want to go to the next slide. The next issue, and one of the things that happens at this time of year that's hard on a lot of our kids, are the changes in the routine that take place around the holiday season, and in some instances, changes in schedule, changes in the degree to which parents tend to be permissive with their children. So one of the things that we know is that, oftentimes, like, our kids, who are more impulsive, kids who may be struggling with ADHD, don't do as well when they don't get their usual sleep that they're accustomed to during the school year. So that, disrupted sleep routines become a problem. Another thing that becomes an issue with our population of kids with ADHD, and this is a sizable group, that there was a recent study that the federal government, that kids between the ages of 5 and 17 has gotten a prescription, at least one prescription, for ADHD medication in their lifetime. And because, with particularly the stimulant medicines, appetite suppression is oftentimes an issue. Parents are worried about the potential of medicine stunning kids' growth. It's not unusual for prescribing physicians to recommend that kids skip medication on weekends and holidays. And so, oftentimes when you're in a situation where, again, routines are changing, sleep's changing, you don't necessarily have the structure in the immediate environment that allows kids to be able to maintain self-control and make good decisions. At the same time, families are oftentimes in a situation where they've been directed by treating physicians or prescribers to skip some of the medicine that helps them to be able to hold their behavior together at school. One other thing to think about is that while we don't have large-scale studies showing that kids with ADHD and disruptive behavior disorders necessarily respond to dietary treatments or interventions, we do know that there are kids who have food allergies where they get a significant exacerbation in their behavior, if they eat too much of the wrong stuff. And so one of the things that parents need to be aware of at this time of year is, for some kids, it's, sugar, it's the dyes in caffeinated soda, it can be, other types of food additives. There are kids who are susceptible to the behavioral impact around changes in diet. And so, that's something that parents and families need to monitor and need to think about, especially like if they're in a situation where they're visiting different homes and they're eating differently than what they normally would. If you take a look at the next slide, one of the other issues that a lot of our kids struggle with at this time of the year, is being around unfamiliar people in unfamiliar environments. And if you look at a lot of the neuroimaging research that the folks from the National Institute of Mental Health have funded, what's really fascinating is that, when you take a look at some of the neuroimaging studies, it becomes clear that a lot of these kids are hardwired to overestimate the level of risk or danger entering a new or unfamiliar situation. And so, like, when you think about like some of the kinds of things that kids are wrestling with at that time of the year, there are a lot of families that may attend worship services who don't ordinarily do that, or kids are attending a worship service with their parents in a sanctuary in a very different environment than where they might be during the course of their time, in their place of worship. You have this situation where kids may end up being around folks who are quote unquote family, but these may be people who are relatively unfamiliar to them. Families are traveling, that they may see certain aunts or uncles or cousins once a year, once every other year. And kids who would wrestle with social anxiety, may struggle when they find themselves surrounded by folks who are unfamiliar. One of the other things that I've seen as being, a challenge that a lot of families deal with at this time of year when they have kids who are anxious and clingy, is something, as simple as like going to visit Santa at the mall, is oftentimes something that's a challenge, and brings about screams and tears and wailing and lots of stress for the family, because parents want to have that keepsake picture and they want their kids to have a perfect holiday. And again, there's certain situations that for the kids that we see oftentimes serve as a trigger. So if you want to go to the next slide. Another issue is traveling. So, again, we've got kids who are oftentimes, they're taking long car trips. There are kids who are getting on planes who aren't necessarily accustomed to that or may not have a lot of experience with this. Again, we know that for certain kids that we have where they struggle with, certain behavior and where routine becomes important, to them, flying across the country to see like grandparents, and you get into issues with changing time zones oftentimes. So that parents thinking about this and sort of planning ahead, it's oftentimes helpful if kids are going to be spending a long time in a car, or if they're going to be on a plane and you don't really know what to expect, and there are times that you get delayed or held up at the gate, or you may be sitting for an extended period of time where you didn't plan for that. Having some snacks available in case kids get hungry if they have to sit for a long time. Some form of entertainment, having that available, and for parents to be aware that cell phones and tablets are okay on an airplane, but computers aren't okay if you're having to, again, sit on the tarmac for a long period of time, or during the early and later parts of a flight. One other thing that's important for parents to remember, where they don't think about this with traveling, but there are certain challenges that arise, is to make sure that in advance you pack all of the medication that family members are going to need, and that you put it in your carry-on as opposed to any sort of checked baggage. There are certain non-controlled medications that, if you run out and you're in a different state, it's relatively easy for us as a physician to be able to call in a prescription for you. But for example, if you have a kid who's on stimulant medication for ADHD, in most instances, although there's some electronic prescribing allowed, those aren't prescriptions that your doctor is going to be able to call in for you. And another issue that we get into is that with certain controlled prescriptions, certain states do not accept prescriptions from a physician or another prescriber out of state. And in our part of the country, for example, people going to New York, Michigan, and California, this is an issue for families that might be coming from Ohio. So that, to avoid challenges associated with missing out on some sort of medicine that's badly needed, you want to make sure that you have medication packed in a secure place, and that you have it on your person, so that if the airline loses your baggage for some reason, or if you don't have access to that baggage for a period of hours and you have a child who needs it, that would be readily available to you. So in tying this all together, Ben, if you go to the next slide, if I was thinking about some helpful holiday hints for families where, they have a child or have a teen that's wrestling with this, probably the first key is very good preparation. And so that if you've got a kid, who's, going to be entering into like an unfamiliar situation where they're going to be seeing relatives that they may not know very well, they're going to be staying in a house that's unfamiliar to them, as many pictures and as much video as you can post of where they're going to be and what they're doing is oftentimes very helpful for anxious kids. In the case of, like, for example, going to visit Santa, having kids, rehearse what they're going to say and to practice in advance is something that's helpful. Or, maybe, one of the things we talk about, when we're dealing with anxious kids with specific phobias is exposure. Taking them to the mall once or twice, having them walk up to the display and take a look at Santa. seeing like, you know, all of the things that are set up around the chair where they're going to meet with them before you actually do is something that can help some kids to be able to overcome those fears. One of the things that parents want to think about and want to prepare for in advance are the conversations that sometimes come up with family members when grandma discovers that, you know, that their grandson or granddaughter is taking medicine for some condition. And, you know, that there are folks who have, you know, very different opinions about the needs and benefits of mental health treatment. You know, there's a significant stigma that's associated with, you know, that continues to this day in some circles for seeking out this kind of treatment for your children. And, you know, and so, you know, in addition to politics, the other thing that you probably shouldn't talk about over the Thanksgiving dinner table, you know, are some of these mental health issues and the decisions that parents have made in terms of seeking medicine. So being able to be, you know, be prepared for any comments or, you know, criticism that you get with other family members, and being prepared to maybe educate them at the same time about, you know, the benefits of the treatment that your son or daughter is receiving is very beneficial themselves during this time of year, because our kids learn from the way that they see adults around them reacting to stressors in the environment. So that to the extent that you as a parent are having a hard time managing your frustrations or fears or holding it together, doing the things that you need to do to take care of yourself so that you can better take care of your kids is important. Again, you know, we talked about busy is better, but at the same time, you need to have some sort of margin in terms of scheduling, you know, and have, you know, have some time buffers in place so that if kids are struggling, families have the time to be able to process that with them, and parents feel less pressured in terms of getting to where they need to be and doing all of the things that they need to do. And I think that most significantly, what parents need to keep in mind, you know, is remember what's important. That, you know, it's interesting when I think back with our kids at like some of the memories that they have over different holidays. You know, they were spontaneous types of things that we didn't necessarily plan for. And a lot of the things that folks stress out about are things that nobody will remember and aren't really all that important in the long run. So, you know, thinking about, you know, the holidays as a time for building and strengthening relationships with families, and, you know, developing memories for your kids based upon those relationships, you know, is really a key takeaway in terms of like what you want your kids to get from the holiday season. And so that finally, for folks who are interested, if you click ahead to the next slide, our organization Key Ministry, we work with churches around the country and around the world to help them welcome and include families who have kids with disabilities, so that we have lots of free resources for church folks who are interested. We put on a major conference every year in Cleveland that'll be this coming April. We have lots of free training videos to help churches, and these are helpful also for other places of worship outside of the Christian tradition. And all these resources are freely available. Roundtables that we put on in terms of hosting, you know, helping to provide training to, you know, churches and other religious organizations looking to welcome families. And then two other resources that we have is that we have a Facebook page specifically for families of kids with disability called Not Alone that we'd welcome people to check out. And we also have specific Facebook groups for people who are involved with special needs or disability ministry, as well as people who are involved in mental health ministry. So with that said, one of the folks who has written for us in the past, by the way, thank you, Ben, for reminding me that people who are interested in learning more can check us out on either Facebook or Twitter, and go to our website at www.keyministry.org. And one of the resources you will find at that website is that in the past, you know, Jolene Philo has done a fair amount of writing and has spoken at some of our conferences. Jolene does a wonderful job talking about some of the issues that kids struggle with trauma, and also has lots of practical hints as having been a special education teacher, you know, in terms of, you know, being able to help kids and families through this time. So I would like to turn it over to Jolene.
Thank you, Steve. Good to be with you. I am so excited to be with you today and talk to you a little bit about practical experience I've had since childhood. My father was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis when I was 2, and I can't remember him walking or working. We cared for him in our home through the 1960s, 1970s, until I graduated and went off to college. And then when I would come back, and then when I came back after I got a job, we would spend Christmas at home with my dad because he couldn't get out anywhere. We had to go to him. And then also in 1982, our first child was born, and he had some pretty significant physical health issues that took a lot of years and a lot of surgeries to correct. And so I am looking at the holidays and thinking about what helped our family, both when I was a child and when I was a parent. What made the difference so that I felt like the holidays were a fun time, and my dad did, and then later my son did. So first I'm going to talk about what people did for our dad, who was pretty much confined to our home as he got older especially. And some of the things that people did, believe it or not, one of the things that made him the happiest during the holiday season was different groups, Boy Scouts, 4-H churches would come and Christmas carol. And that was wonderful. We all felt like our community came to us when we couldn't go out to them. And Dad felt remembered. And it was freezing, because you'd open the door and listen to the carolers, and we lived in Iowa, so it was cold as could be, but that didn't really matter. It was the fact that people remembered. The same thing happened for our son when he was 15. He had his last big major surgery before Christmas, a few weeks before Christmas, and the entire choral music department from the high school, and my son was in high school then, they all came over and Christmas caroled. And for my son to see his friends take the time to come to our house to sing for us really meant a lot to all of us. So those are the kinds of things that can make a difference. And if you aren't actually a caregiver or someone dealing with a disability, these are ideas you can use to bring Christmas to families who can't get out. In this day and age, it's pretty easy. You can just text somebody once a day and let them know you're thinking about them over the holiday season, or suggest getting together and doing something. Now that will mean you going over there, but you can do it. We had a stream of people all through my childhood and beyond, who just people from town who had known my father before he was ill, and they would come over and they would just sit with him and visit with him. One gentleman who was a court reporter even would bring old court proceedings for Dad to read if he wanted. The problem was Dad couldn't read very well, but somebody else told us about, at that time, books and magazines for the blind that were recorded through, I think, the National Institute of the Blind. And now it's a lot easier because you could just go over and help set somebody up with audiobooks so they could listen to audiobooks. Other things that are fun, just go over and watch a movie. My husband had a back surgery and was out of commission for quite a while. And the thing he remembers most, and there were many kindnesses done to us for my husband during that time, but the one he remembers the most is that a friend brought over his favorite movie and they watched it together. That's not that hard to do, and it's actually kind of fun. You can send cards. That is huge. Anytime I, as a parent, got a card when our son was going through troubles, or I know when my parents got cards from other people, just remembering them, not necessarily the Christmas letter, but just another note or a card saying, we're thinking about you, we hope your holidays are going well. Those are great things that you can do for each other too. So if you're a caregiver and you know if someone else is a caregiver, send them a note, send them a text, send them a card. Those things are great. One of the things I think that made the biggest impact when we were kids was we had an aunt and uncle who had 3 kids who lived in the same town as we did. And we always did some of Christmas together. And very often that would involve Sunday afternoon. They would come over, they would bring their kids. My parents and all the adults would play cards. We kids would go play whatever kids play. And there would be food involved in that. There would be at some point opening of presents. And I just remember that, and I know my parents do too, with a great deal of love and thankfulness, because we had this family situation going on. We felt loved, we felt included, and it was just a tradition in our family. They came over probably twice a month, and even more during Christmas, the Christmas holidays, because all our parents were teachers. That was huge. I'm thinking now, as an adult, something my dad really would have enjoyed that didn't happen to him, and I know my kids enjoyed when we did it with them, was to read aloud. How hard would that be to get a book, maybe even the Christmas Carol, if that's something you enjoy, and make a tradition of going over and reading that to a person who has a disability, who can't read for him or herself, or even doing it as a family with your children who have disabilities. And you could stretch it out over a couple weeks or an hour a night or whatever, so nobody gets too antsy. Pay attention to each person's attention span so that you're meeting their needs. That's a possibility too. Another thing that I think can be really helpful, especially if you're dealing with an older person who's disabled or dealing with some physical or mental illness, if they have tech questions and need help running their computer, programming their phone, downloading things, you could go over and help them do that. And keep coming back then to make sure they understand what they're doing and to practice it a little more. Those are always good things to do. And the more we can do to make a person with disabilities or special needs of any kind more independent, the better, because they want to be independent. They want to do things by themselves, and they want to be able to contribute. So we can teach them skills and help them learn to be contributing members of the holiday season, if you want to put it that way. One other thing I think is really important is to be cognizant and understanding of people's food needs. I didn't realize how important that was until several years ago. I was finally diagnosed with a dairy allergy. I took dairy out of my diet, and it made a huge change in my quality of life. But to this day, there are people who try to persuade me that I need to add ice cream to my pie, or I should go and try this thing, or that, I'm just kind of being unreasonable by saying, well, I need things that are dairy-free. I offer to bring things so that I know there's something I can eat, but it is surprising how many people will blame the person with a food sensitivity or allergy for what's happening to them. We would never do that to someone with diabetes, and it's a similar kind of situation. So be cognizant and understanding and make allowances for that person who has food sensitivities and allergies. And that goes from adults all the way down to children. You are making the lives of families at the holidays much easier if you can provide some things that they can eat when there are gatherings. So that's kind of it with dealing with adults. I want to delve a little bit more into what Steve was talking about with children during the holidays who may have disabilities or mental health issues, whatever it is. There are so many things we can do as parents to make a difference there. And I want to start by telling you one of the hardest things I encountered as a teacher was the day before Christmas vacation and the day before summer vacation. Most of my students were so excited about a couple weeks off, and getting to go home and play with the toys and anticipating the new things they get at Christmas and going swimming in the summer. But there were always a few children in my classes who did not want vacation to happen because vacation was a hard time for them. And the safest environment they knew in their lives was school. So we need to be very aware as parents, as people surrounding parents and families, that there are children who don't consider home a safe place. And we need to be watching out for that. And whatever the reason may be, it may be because there are some abuse situations going on. It may be because there's a parent who has disabilities and struggles to get through the day and does the best they can. But we need to come around those families and support the children as much as we can. And I loved what Steve had to say about the woman in their neighborhood who had the cookie baking day where all the children could come and bake cookies. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing for us to do in our neighborhoods, in our places of worship, and bring in some of those children so that they have that sense of security and safety and a feeling that they are part of a community that cares about them. That's really important to the children, and it's important to the families who are doing a good job with their children. But what Steve said about making a routine during the holidays and being consistent is so true. Now, I know some of you have to work while your children are on break, and so you're going to have to make those arrangements, whether it's with a daycare provider or a camp situation, or you have relatives who will come in and watch the children while you are at work, whatever it is, or if there's a nanny or whatever, you need to work to make sure that is somewhat consistent for the kids. So here are some things I would suggest that worked for us when our kids were home. Thankfully, I was a teacher when my kids were little, so I was home with them. And my mom was a teacher, so she was home with us during the holidays. And here's some things that we found worked very well. Now, the first one, when I was a kid, I thought my mother was a dragon lady for doing this and just the most unreasonable person around. During Christmas break and during summer vacation, our routine was that we did chores in the morning and the fun started after lunch. So Mom had lists of chores for us to do. In the winter, it would be things like scooping snow. In the summer, it was mowing lawns. She kind of had this obsession with making sure we had the cleanest garage in town. And so there would be periodically mornings where we would have to haul everything out of the garage, sweep it out, and put everything back in. Probably 2 or 3 times during the summer. That was our big thing. We had to work on our 4-H projects. We had to clean the house. We had to help cook. Mom would empty every cupboard in the kitchen over a series of a number of days. We would have to wash everything that was in the cupboard, wash out the cupboards, put everything away. Same with cleaning the basement, whatever it was. Now, as I said, my brother and sister and I thought that she was the most dragon lady kind of person around, but she wasn't. She was providing routine. I see that now. She also provided an example, and we learned how to do things like cook and clean and deep clean and mow the lawn and shovel snow and do laundry, so that when we left our home, we were prepared and we knew how to take care of a house. We need to be doing that for all our children. We need to be doing that as much as possible with our kids who have disabilities. And as I said before, the more we can do to teach them independence and skills, the better off they will be throughout their life. So it's important for us to do and make accommodations for every child's needs. But we do that anyway, don't we, when our children are young? We maybe only ask our toddlers to help fold the washcloths and towels, where we ask our 15-year-old to help do the whole laundry and sort things and help fold things and get things back to other people's rooms. So we make those accommodations for age. We just need to do the same thing for our children's disability. So having a work time in the morning is a good idea. Other things you can do is make sure you have craft time. Kids love crafts. Even older kids love crafts. So maybe arrange for a craft time. If you watch sales at different craft stores like Hobby Lobby and Michael's, you can buy craft supplies very inexpensively and buy things that will work for different ages and just do crafts at home. Other things that you can do are have cooking time. You know, bake Christmas cookies together as a family. Or one thing my mom always did if there was a snow day was we bake cinnamon rolls together. And I need to get that on my schedule for this year with my grandkids who live with us. So we would do those traditional baking things and learn how to do that, have fun doing it. You can have movie time every evening if you want. I would say limit screen time as much as you possibly can with your kids and make that screen time something you do as a family. I know that's hard. I know in some cases that means you have to maybe set limits on phones and other devices, but the more you can limit that and have face-to-face interaction with family members, the better off your kids are. They'll have time for screen time, and you can work that in. You can say that at this point in time, you're going to get your half hour of screen time, and tonight we're all going to watch a movie together, or we're going to do video games together, or whatever it is you want to do as a family. But get that structured in, because kids truly do better with structured time throughout the holidays. Have a read aloud time every evening. When our kids were younger, one of the best things we ever did was go to hear a speaker who said, turn off your television. That's when all we had was television. But turn off your television except for a half hour a night. Each child can choose what they're going to watch, and then they can watch each other's show. But the rest of the time, spend it as a family. Play board games. Wonderful skill building when we do board games. You learn to play, to take turns. Younger kids learn their numbers. They learn how to count. They learn how to lose gracefully and how to win gracefully. They learn how to cooperate and keep the game moving. Those are wonderful things to do with our kids. Read aloud time every night is really crucial. Our kids loved it. In fact, we did read aloud time with our kids clear through high school. And at some point, my daughter, who's the younger of our two children, turned that around, and she started being the read aloud person. And we did let our kids start reading aloud to us as soon as they were able. My daughter totally turned that around and did all of the reading aloud to my husband, who's not a big reader because he has some dyslexia issues. So those are great skills to learn, and they learned how to do voices, and they learned all sorts of things. And you can encourage that in your kids and make the holiday season a time for that. Make sure you put in a lot of time for fun. Steve mentioned going to the library. I recently found out that at least in Iowa, maybe this is true in other states too, your library actually has free passes to different venues, family venues in your area. So for us, it's the art museum, it's Living History Farms, it's a skating rink in the Des Moines area, it's the Science Center and Museum for Kids, and there are a few other ones. And once a year, every family can check out that pass and take their family to that venue for free, to each venue. That's amazing. And I really encourage you, as Steve did, to use your library as much as possible. A couple other things I want to mention. Lower your expectations. Don't go for a full-blown Christmas. We have an almost 2-year-old living in our house right now who can climb everything and get into everything. We aren't even going to have a Christmas tree this year. I ordered a felt Christmas tree we can put on the wall, and then the kids can go and just put the decorations up and take them down. That's going to be our Christmas tree. It's going to lower everybody's stress. Also, things like if your child is just not going to make it to see Santa at the mall, no matter what you do, see if you can find somebody to bring Santa to your home. This also works for families who have kids who aren't mobile enough to get out. So those are just a few hints, and I'd love to hear your hints. I encourage you to go to my website, differentdream.com, and just type in holiday tips or holiday ideas. You're going to get posts that'll come up from a lot of bloggers who have ideas about how to make your holidays easier. So with that, I want to pass things off to Katie, who is going to be talking to you about what life has been like for her dealing with a mental illness and how she has learned to cope. Take it away, Katie.
Thank you so much, Jolene. So I want to start out by asking all of you a question. Has there ever been anything that you wanted to get, or something that you wanted to achieve, and maybe you felt like there was a roadblock in front of you that was stopping you from getting whatever it is? Maybe when you were growing up, it was getting a good grade in that tough class, or going out for a sports team and getting hurt, or a part in a play, or when you got older, it was having enough money to get that car, that vacation, that house. Maybe for some of you, it's been something a little deeper, like acceptance or love from your friends or your family members. Maybe for some of you, it's just happiness. For me, that's what it was when I was growing up. I had a lot of trouble just being happy. But if you had known me when I was growing up, I was a huge jokester, huge class clown. I smiled way too much, laughed way too much, joked around way too much. I was that kid in class that was always in trouble because I was hilarious, and the teachers did not think I was hilarious. So for any teachers who are listening, on behalf of all of your terrible students, I'm so sorry. But that was when other people were around. When it was just me, I felt like I was behind that roadblock, kind of watching everybody else be genuinely happy. The first time I thought about taking my own life and took action to see what that might be like, I was really young, about 5 or 6 years old. And I learned through NAMI, actually, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, that 1% of children under the age of 10 can experience thoughts and feelings like that. And I was in that 1%. So, I felt like from there, my situation and my circumstances kept getting a lot worse. And maybe a lot of you guys listening can relate. My parents divorced, and my mom, living with her own diagnoses of mental illness, often neglected me, meaning that we didn't always have food in the home. I didn't get medical treatment when I genuinely needed it. And she became pregnant with this man that I did not know. They could both be violent and abusive, verbally, physically. They abused alcohol and other substances. And, by the time my baby brother was born, I felt like it was up to me to take care of him. And I was only 12 years old. So I fed him and I changed him and I took care of him when he was sick, and he was sick all the time. He was a sickly baby. I taught him manners, how to swim, how to ride a bike. I disciplined him. When I could drive, I dropped him off at school and I picked him up from school. And, when he was 4 years old, he would still call me mommy. And I had to remind him that I'm sissy. But, even during those middle school years, I could feel like something wasn't right. I remember going to my mom and I would say, I think there's something wrong with me. I think I need to see someone. And I was only 11, 12, 13 when I would say this to her. So I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what kind of help I needed, but I knew that there was something gravely wrong with the way that I was perceiving my own happiness to be compared to the happiness of my friends and my classmates. By the time I was a freshman in high school, I was 100% sure. I knew with absolute certainty that I was not going to live to see my senior year. I started abusing my body with alcohol and cigarettes and medication and self-harm. I stopped doing everything that I loved, things I had done all my life. I just completely lost the motivation, like dance and music and theater and basketball. And, although all of this was going on, nobody, not even my best friends in the world, knew anything about it. Friends I'd had since kindergarten. I was an expert at hiding my home life, and I was an expert at hiding my scars from self-harm. I wore bracelets to cover them up, and I still do out of habit. But, it didn't help as well that from 6th grade through pretty much, all through high school, I felt really relentlessly daily picked on and bullied at school. So when I was 16, I was a junior, and I remember I got into this terrible argument in the car with my mother. And I ended up telling her that I was miserable and that I was going to take my own life. And, to this day, I cannot forget how she responded. She screamed at me and she cursed at me, and, she got right in my face and she said, if you're that crazy, if you're that much of a lunatic, then go ahead and do it. Kill yourself. And it was because of that I just lost all hope. And I was attempting, which was when my dad stepped in and got me into treatment for the first time ever, counseling, therapy for a start, which was one of the most amazing things that happened to me in high school, and one of the most amazing things my dad ever did for me. When I was a teenager, I might not have said so, because nobody wants to sit down in front of a stranger and tell them really vulnerable things, especially teenagers. But it really, really was. In counseling, I was diagnosed with depression. I was able to just sit and talk to somebody about what was going on in my life, what had been going on, and be taught ways to cope that were good, that were beneficial for me, that worked with me. For instance, like exercise became huge for me, and meditation, and just getting outside. I was pursuing my own personal faith in Christianity. And, all that put together is why I get to be here and talk to all of you today, and not be buried in a graveyard somewhere down here in Florida. But there's this quote from the book Candide by Voltaire that I love. And in it, he says, "I've wanted to kill myself 100 times, but somehow I am still in love with life." My mental health journey doesn't stop there. I would later develop, issues with anxiety, panic attacks, eating disorders, and along with depression and suicidal ideations, but I am in love with life, which is why I tell people that I haven't recovered from mental illness. I live in recovery, because when we live with something like anxiety or depression or bipolar disorder or borderline or schizophrenia or any of the other many mental illnesses, every day can be a struggle. Every week, every month, it gets better, and then it gets worse, and then it gets better, and then it gets worse, but it gets better, and it keeps getting better. So if you flash forward to today, my baby brother and I are extraordinarily close. He's 10 going on 11, which is wild to me. He's at that stage where, when I'm dancing in public, he tugs on my shirt and tells me that I'm making him miserable and I'm embarrassing him. So things are going really well. But I decided to move to Orlando, where I live now, and study psychology and now master's in mental health counseling so that I can be a therapist one day. And I get to work for NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, which does such amazing work for individuals who live with mental illness and their family members. And, because of the work that I've done and having lived experience and knowing other people with lived experience, I can say, and I believe we all can say, that the exciting thing about mental illness is that it is so unique. It is unique to each individual, each family. There's different types of mental health conditions, different severities of that illness, different treatment. Recovery looks different for everybody. And even within the same diagnosis, recovery looks different. And with even looking at, the biopsychosocial model, there's different theories about how we acquire mental illness, whether we were born with it, genetics, whether, it's acquired through trauma or circumstances. So I'm going to nail down just a few points that I've thought about about why mental illness can be hard around the holiday season. And the first is being pressure. Really simple. I think we can, pressure is even adamant among anyone who's going through something hard during the holiday season, or who's someone who is struggling in any way, because, we see all the holiday movies and the ads, and, it's time to be merry and jolly, and you're just excited about the holidays coming up, no matter what faith background you come from. And we as humans, we start to compare ourselves, and we feel pressured to mimic what we're seeing around us on social media, on TV. And, we get this idea of what we think our family is supposed to look like, what we think the holidays are supposed to look like. Stress sets in financially, between family members, all kinds of things. And to me, I imagine it's kind of like a water bottle without a cap on, filled to the brim with water. And, the water is just what hurts us, and emotions that we have, things that we're struggling with. And when we put pressure on that water bottle, it spills over, it overflows. The second point that I want to make is stigma around mental illness. And what is stigma? Stigma is judgment, stereotyping, labeling, seeing someone as their diagnosis and not as who they are, who God made them to be, or whatever you believe. And when we stigmatize others, we can distance ourselves, we judge, we discriminate. And when it comes to mental illness, sometimes we never talk about it. We just completely avoid the topic. And so, for example, around the holidays, we all know that Uncle Joe is battling cancer, that Aunt Jane had a stroke last year, that Cousin Jimmy lives with diabetes, and we show up for them, and we know how to show up for them. But what about Jack living with bipolar disorder, or Susan living with schizophrenia? Do we even know how to show up for them? And so why would they want to be around us, around the family during the holidays, if they feel like nobody understands or that nobody wants to? So I think there's no harm in asking the question, how are you doing? How is your mental health doing? And, just saying things like, I love you, I care about you. That's all. Let me know if there's any way that I can be there for you. Any way that I can be there for you, around the holidays right now. I think that's so, so important. No harm in asking that question. And the third point that I want to make is just with trauma. Not all mental illness stems from trauma, but in the cases when it does, it's so hard. Because someone who has to, go home for the holidays might just be filled with the reminder of how they ended up with a mental health condition in the first place. And most of the time, extended family has no idea what's going on in immediate families. And sometimes members of immediate family don't know what's going on in that family. For example, one of my best friends, when we were in college and we were living together, she found out, and her mother found out, that her little sister had been sexually abused by her father when they were growing up. For years, nobody knew. I can tell you that when I was growing up, I never told my dad what was going on when I'd be at mom's house, let alone extended family, and let alone what those experiences were doing to me. And, if it's not with relationships where there was trauma, it can be just geography. And going to a place, home for the holidays, where, a trauma was experienced outside of the family, just being in that place can be really hard and a reminder of what happened. And sometimes that ends up looking like an individual not showing up around the holidays. And if they do, they might not be as engaged. So, if any of this resonates with you, I would love to encourage you guys to reach out to that family member and ask the question, how can I show up for you this holiday season? I love you. I want to make sure that I can give you your Christmas present. Can we meet up somewhere? When can we meet up? When can we talk on the phone? Just ask them what works best for them. Once during or after a presentation at a school, I had a girl ask me, if you could change your circumstances, if you could change what happened to you, if you could change your mental health state and conditions, would you? That is a loaded question. But I think what we need to do is we not only need to create safe space for our children, our teens, our loved ones, but brave space to share what's going on in their lives and what's going on in their heart, what's going on in their mental health. I don't think we need to be these tough moms, dads, caregivers who don't want to talk about anything or don't want to talk about what hurts. We can be human and let, the young people in our family know they can be human too. We can let our loved ones know that they can talk to us when something is wrong and when their hearts are hurting, that they're loved even when they don't feel it, that they're valued even if they don't believe it, and that they're worthy of living joyfully, of being listened to, that, their story is not too big or too heavy. What they're going through is not too big, too heavy. And that ultimately there is a life worth loving out there, and it includes them. So thank you guys so much for listening to me. Ben, I want to pass it off to you if there's any questions that need to be answered.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katie, for sharing that perspective. Dr. Steve, for your presentation, and Jolene, for you sharing as well some of the perspectives of each of you from your different points of view. I think we've had a really rich conversation. We're going to go a little over to get into some of the questions, so I hope you can stay with us. If not, always remember that we're going to be recording the rest of this session if you need to leave. And you can come back to watch these question and answers as a follow-up later on when you get the email with the recording, as well as the PowerPoints and all the other materials that we're going to send. Also note that a lot of the websites that we've talked about, I need to put in NAMI's website, but we talked about differentdream.com and keyministry.org as resources that can provide additional information. Katie, I'm going to come to you first to ask a question that I think I got through when we talked, and I love the way you framed it. And it was just a slightly different framing from what you put forward here. You said that you hope family and other families would love their loved ones with lived experience through their decision, whatever that decision might be for the holiday season. Could you talk a little bit more about what that means for you and kind of what we talked about before?
Yeah, I can say, just from my own lived experience, the holidays are really hard. I think I spoke with Ben, before we did this webinar, and when I found out about this webinar, I laughed. And I looked at my best friend and told her about the webinar, and she laughed. And we laughed because mental illness is hard around the holidays. It is so hard. It's, for me, it's probably the hardest season of the year, really. And it took me several years after being an adolescent to realize that. And so, when we are experiencing the toughest season of the entire year for us, there's certain ways that we have the holidays. For instance, we don't want to go home for the holidays, or we might not want to see certain people around the holidays or be in certain cities around the holidays. And I think what's best is, to approach that loved one, that family member, with the lived experience, with just empathy and compassion of like, oh my gosh, this is the hardest season of the year for this person. How can I be there for them? If a family member came to me and said like, hey, I know we miss you every Christmas. How can I see you this Christmas? I would say, oh, well, let's meet up. Like, let's have dinner. Let's get lunch. So just showing up for that person and respecting their decision about how they want to uphold their own personal boundaries for their mental health around the holidays, I think is really, really important and really awesome. If we can just look at people with compassion instead of judgment or anything like that.
Thanks, Katie. That's excellent. And I want to encourage that. I think what we want to do going into this holiday season is approach loved ones, caregivers with empathy and encouragement. And again, I love that frame. But love does them through the decision, whatever that decision might be, in ways that we can support our families and encourage them in different ways. Dr. Steve, what are some things, you focused a lot on children and youth, but what are some things that you might think would be unique to adults, that adults may experience differently, like routines and things? I mean, a lot of what you presented on translates up for adult populations as well, but there are some different and unique ways that there may need to think about how maybe mom or dad having mental illness as opposed to a child having mental illness, and ways in which communities, organizations can support those families just as much as we support children who may be experiencing mental illness.
Well, it's kind of interesting, like thinking about it from like the perspective of when parents have struggles. I would think that like it would be important for to extended family to like recognize that when parents are having like that kind of an issue, that's a time where they may need to step in and to provide more support. Like for example, I thought Jolene had like a wonderful example of when she was talking about like some of the things that they've done because of the 2-year-old who's like now living in their house. So that like if that like if you have a sibling, or if you like a child where they're struggling with a mental health issue as an adult, maybe they have children that they're responsible for, stepping up and trying to maybe schedule some time to have like some one-on-one time with their kids, or being able to to engage with them and take them to some of the activities that maybe their parent isn't up to taking them to, would be something that they could do to help. And sort of coming back to what we talked about before, I mean, parents can be authoritative in their parenting without being authoritarian. So that, that there's a balance between like, being Scrooge, and not letting your kids do anything, but keeping in mind that for many kids who wrestle with this more so than their peers, being able to maintain a regular bedtime, being able to maintain a schedule, getting your medication on time when you're supposed to do that. Jolene had talked about like people wanting to put ice cream on your pie all the time, over the holidays, that, recognizing that the effect that diet would have on your child or on your loved one, and trying to, again, it's a time for fun. People are doing a lot of things that they aren't accustomed to doing, but you do need to have some routine for folks who struggle with any mental health concern that would impact executive function when you're looking at kids.
Thanks, Steve. And just so people are asking, can we share this recording with others? We couldn't be more happy for you to share this recording with others. We hope that you will consider, maybe there's a family member you can send this webinar to that might answer some questions. I mean, in some ways, this webinar might be an open door to offer some conversations, start some dialogues that might need to happen to help other people know about certain circumstances and situations. Jolene, one of the questions that we got is going to come to you, and it's a little bit about how do we have some of these difficult conversations around disability or challenges, whether or not it's food allergy to mental illness, special needs. What are some ways that we broach those topics with loved ones and family members so that they can be there to support us in times of need and just be there to support us, as Katie said, just through the midst of what we're going through? What are some ways that we can bring up some of those conversations and dialogues?
Well, the main thing is we have to be willing to do it. We have to be willing to be transparent and admit that we are having issues and we need help. We can't be that, we call it at our house, if anybody's familiar with the Little House on the Prairie books, the Pa Ingalls syndrome, where you have to do everything by yourself and you can't ask anyone for help. So you have to not be Pa Ingalls. And then there are several things you can do. If there is
Jolene, I think we may have lost your audio there. Jolene, you there? Oh, goodness. She was about ready to share something wonderful, I am sure. Let me just try something real quick. I think we lost Jolene. Well, let me invite somebody else to jump into Jolene's spot earlier. What are some ways we can start those conversations? Katie, Steve, any ideas about ways that we can begin those conversations with family members to help reduce some of that stigma and to increase awareness about the challenges in these spaces? So Katie, come off mute.
Sorry,
there
Steve.
You go. Go ahead.
Do you want to go first, Steve?
No, go ahead, Katie.
Just some basic things that come to mind is, like I mentioned, just asking the questions to our loved ones. You know, are you going through something? How can I be there for you? And like I said, just making that space, you know, brave for that person to step into that space and say, yes, I am going through something. Here's what it is. You know, I got diagnosed with this last year or this 10 years ago. And here's what it looks like. And just normalizing those conversations as we would if we had gotten diagnosed with anything else.
Dr. Steve, you're still on mute.
So what I would follow up with on that is that, you know, if you have a family member where you see that they're struggling, it doesn't hurt to ask, you know, someone if they're hurting, or if they're having thoughts about self-injury, or if they're having thoughts about suicide. That's the loving thing to do, you know, as opposed to curing like the fear that by bringing up the topic that somehow you're going to make it worse for them. So that making sure that when you see people who are struggling, that you are available to come alongside them. And, you know, one of the things that certain faith leaders in our tradition have talked about is the gift of presence. And simply being there to be available to listen, you know, and to be in relationship with folks when they're going through this is one of the best gifts that you can give somebody at this time of year.
Yeah, being present can be an amazing way to provide that brave space and just to be willing to sit. I think another presenter I think of, they say just when somebody says too that they're hurting, that you don't run away, that you don't walk away, that you stay present with them and you're willing to sit with them in those challenges as they're vulnerable and being willing to just be present. You don't have to fix that problem. You can just be present to those challenges. And I think that can be a gift that we can give others during this holiday season, to be present with our loved ones and family members who are struggling with mental illness, any form of challenge or disability, and be willing to be present with them and not force our dairy ice cream, not force our solution, not force our prescription of what works for us, but how can we be present with and be participant in the solutions that they're finding for themselves. And so, as Katie mentioned, if that means you might not be able to come to holiday, how can I join you in how you're celebrating your holiday season? and being willing to love someone through their decision, whatever that might be, to protect their wellness. We want to work with and support individuals in that way. So I want to thank our presenters. I want to thank Dr. Steve, Katie, Jolene. It's been such a great, rich amount of information. I think everyone will be able to come back to a lot of these pieces and to think about ways. Again, we encourage people to share what they've heard today as well with loved ones, family members, maybe increase awareness. We'll send a link to the recording, and it'll be available on our YouTube page soon so that you can share it through YouTube as well. I want to thank our presenters again. It's been so helpful and wonderful. I want to thank you all who joined us today for taking time out of your busy day. Please share the information that you've heard today. Think about ways you can communicate it to others. Maybe share it with your own faith community or tradition to encourage them to think about what it might mean for them and their community through the holiday season. And be sure to register for our next webinar in January, where we're going to focus on understanding a form of obsessive compulsive disorder that includes religious behavior, and consider how that can help us understand the intersection of mental illness and religion. We'll send a link to register in the follow-up email after this webinar. If you're not on our mailing list, please send us a note to partnerships@hss.gov. We'd love to be in touch and share more about what we're doing in the future. And that's it. Thank you again to our presenters. Thank you for joining us out of your busy day. We hope you'll have a fruitful rest of your day and a very happy and empathy-filled holiday season. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.